Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Huntsville, Alabama at the Space and Rocket Center, one of the world's truly great space museums here in what is the seat of America's space program, both Gemini, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and beyond. Obviously, the Marshall Space Flight Center is on Redstone Arsenal just down the road, and we're talking to Ed Stewart, who is the curator here of this extraordinary collection, world's largest space collection, Ed. So that gives you only very, very small headaches as a curator.
Yeah. It's no problem, really. No problem.
No problem at all. And I know you've got busy meetings today because, you know, it's a lot about the paint. You guys have that extraordinary Saturn V that's sitting outside, which is a replica. More importantly, this is a national historic treasure that's sitting here. Talk to us about some of the key ways you guys are commemorating Apollo 50 and particularly the Apollo 11 landing. 50th commemoration will be in July. Talk to us a little bit about what you're doing there to help tell this story to the public.
Sure. So a couple of the key things that we have going are we did just open a 7,500 square foot exhibit all dedicated to Apollo 11, and it sort of tells the story of how we get to the moon in the context of the Cold War and the different cultural strife, you know, moments we were having in the U.S. with the civil rights movement, the protest movement, the Vietnam War, and then it sort of kind of climaxes at the Apollo 11 landing, and we go on to talk about sort of the legacy of Apollo after that. So that's our first thing that we've already completed. Of course, we're painting our replica Saturn V that's outside, repainting that for this year as part of the anniversary events. We've got a planned set of activities in July, banquets. Don't want to give too much away about those. You know, with special guests and that sort of thing. And we're also planning on doing a reenactment starting in, I think it's June, and happening regularly throughout the rest of the year in honor of the first landing. And the reenactment will actually take place in this building down at the far end near our lunar module that we have.
It really is amazing. There are some of us who were a little disappointed that Apollo 8 didn't get the recognition it deserved, so it's great to see that everybody's working on the Apollo 11 side of things. Talk to us about some of the key elements. I mean, this museum has so much to offer. Sure. So really, if anybody is, you know, if you go to Nashville, drive an hour and a half south and be sure to see this museum because you're not going to regret it. But what do you think, you know, if you were going to be telling people and say, hey, look, here are the top 10 things we have that we're most proud of in this exhibit, because obviously everybody, as any museum, will find what they think is important. Right. I mean, here we have an F1 engine behind us, one of the most extraordinary power plants in human history, without which the moon mission wouldn't have happened. Talk to us about what you think are sort of the 10 things you're most proud of that are in your collection.
Oh, goodness. It's like trying to pick your 10 favorite children. Obviously, we have the landmark Saturn V. What we've got is the Saturn V dynamic test vehicle, and it is our marquee artifact that we have on display. And I sort of think of that as it's the one that came before all the others, because without that element of testing, then it would have been impossible to know whether or not the rocket would do what it needed to do. So that's a huge thing. We have a number of F1 engines like the one behind me, and those are critical because they were the power plant of the first stage of the Saturn V, and they were really mostly developed and tested here in Huntsville, and so it was a huge part of what Marshall Space Flight Center did to contribute to the Apollo lunar landings. We have a J2 engine, which was another second and third stage engine for the Saturn V. We have the Apollo 16 command module, which is a huge draw because that's actually a flown to the moon and back module. We do have an Apollo 12 lunar sample, so about the size of a softball, kind of tucked away behind our Apollo capsule.
The funniest moon mission ever.
Yes.
The most humorous crew ever.
Yes, easily. And the most artistic, as it turns out, with Mr. Bean's artistic career.
And very sad that he passed recently.
Yes.
So he was a true giant.
Yeah, very unfortunate, but he really made an impact both in the program and on the culture with his artistic work. Moving a little bit away from the hardware end of what we have that I think is so important, we were sort of brought into existence through Werner von Braun, who kind of lobbied to create this sort of public display to acknowledge what was going on in the state of Alabama for the space program and for defense. And so we have a lot of his collection here, and one of the things that we have on display is a notebook from his childhood, 14 years old, where he sketched out, did the math, figured out well, if I'm going to be in space for this long, how much oxygen do I need, water, food, how much battery power, et cetera, et cetera, in this little teardrop spaceship. And it's all hand-drawn in pencil, and it's survived, from, was it 1930 or 1928 to present day through the World War and everything. So I think that's another one of our sort of hallmark pieces. And then we have just other things that are phenomenal. We have some training simulators. So John Glenn, Alan Shepard crawled into a Mercury procedures trainer that we have here on site in order to learn how to fly their spacecraft. So it's a really fantastic collection of objects that are unique in the world and are critical to the history of the American space program.
It really is. I mean, when I saw that procedures trainer, I was just like, oh my God, oh my God. Everybody knows I get very enthusiastic about this. Now, talk to us about the challenge of curation, right? These artifacts were not designed to have a long life. Some of them are toxic, some of them degrade very, very rapidly. Some are industrial scale, so I mean, there are some parts of it that you don't have to worry about, but there are other parts of it that just decay, and now the challenge is how do you preserve this history? Talk to us a little bit about the challenge of doing that.
Absolutely. Preserving these items, one of the biggest challenges that we face is simply scale. When it comes to a real Saturn V, you're talking 363 feet of rocket that we need to figure out how to preserve. We've done the best possible thing that you can do with our Saturn V, which is we brought it indoors. So it's going to be in pretty good shape for a very long time. But we do have a number of outdoor static display rockets, and our Saturn I Block II that we have, which was another dynamic test vehicle, is standing vertically outdoors. It's about 180 feet, and we're in the process of getting it inspected and repainted and repaired. And so we have to involve a lot of different disciplines. It's not just a fresh coat of paint. We do bring in engineering teams to examine the structural elements of the rocket to make sure that they're doing what they need to do, because they were made to be launched into space one time. That's it. Keeping them on display outdoors for 50, 60, 70 years was never part of the equation. So we do run into issues with things like making sure that any asbestos that was used in any of the thermal insulation has been removed and replaced with something that's not going to be harmful over time. Keeping an eye on some of the exotic metals that we have things like magnesium nuts and bolts that can pose a bit of a problem. We have things like Inconel, so you don't want to go like sanding on rocket engines because they need to be repolished or something, because the dust from that is toxic.
Beryllium, which is deadly.
Exactly. So there's a number of different elements, and we do a lot of very careful research before we start each project to make sure that we understand exactly what has to happen for every part, every element, every stage of that process. And when you work on the scale that we do, it's a really big challenge physically, but also financially as well, because it takes a lot of money to buy the paint, to hire the staff, to manage it, and my time for supervision and that sort of thing. So. You mentioned the Saturn I, which was the iconic skyline thing here for 3 decades or more, right? I mean, it was the first element of that, and that is an original test article as well. And then in 2009, you built the replica of the Saturn V, and it is really incredible to stand at the base of that and look up and see the sheer scale of that rocket. And you're in the process of repainting it, but you did have a little bit of a white knuckle experience because it ended up yellow for a bit. So tell us a little bit about how that, because right, it's got to be like the George Washington Bridge. When you finish painting it, you got to start painting it again. Yeah, well, hopefully it won't take that long. But no, we did have I did have a moment of panic, because as the guys in the crane were prepping the surface to be painted, one of the stages that they went through was applying a sealing coat that had like a yellow tint to it. So when they went over the white paint that they had just sort of sanded and scraped and everything, it turned that paint really this very dingy, unappealing yellow. And I had that moment of panic in the back of my head that said, did I send them a typo when I gave them the color code for the paint? And then they started putting the top coat on there, and it was exactly what it should have been. But it still gave me that heart palpitation for just a split second.
And talk to us about what's going to be required to, you guys have a full stack of the space shuttle, the booster, and the external tank. It's incredibly impressive to be next to that, to see the size of that. I mean, it's a DC-9 sized flight vehicle. Talk to us about what the challenge is going to be to redo that.
So, we're actually working with Marshall Space Flight Center right now to get engineering done so that we can understand best not just how to like pick up and move the orbiter when we'll need to do that, to do the repairs and the repainting and the replacement, but to make sure that after the amount of time that it's been up there, the lifting points that are built into it are still in good shape and have integrity, and we can safely lift and move it. But we've got to do a lot of surface repairs. We're hoping not to have to do much structural repair, right now it looks like it's mostly just mitigating corrosion, which is good. And there's some debate about whether or not we're going to defoam the tank, which means scraping all the foam off and then reapplying, because the foam over time has started to fail. And then we'll be surface preparing and repainting the boosters that are with it. It's going to be a big complex project. Again, we've got a lot of different materials that we're working with, and it's everything from urethane-based foam coating the tank to really high-grade aluminum on the tank skin, some not carbon fiber, but some composite fiber windings on the experimental solid rocket boosters that we have. So it's a complex beast, and we've started chipping away at the edges of that to make sure that, again, we know everything that we're getting into as best as we can before we take a crack at it. But it does look like unstacking the orbiter or peeling the skin off the orbiter where it sits is one of the two directions we're going to go. It's going to be a hugely complex process.
Ed Stewart, curator here at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. Absolute pleasure meeting you. Great watch, by the way. He's sporting the Bulova moon watch, which is a very, 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 very historic timepiece. And by the way, so tell the interesting story about that, by the way. So, there's the Omega Speedmaster. Right. I've got an Omega, but mine it needs repair. Bulova was the other certified flight watch. And tell us the story about Dave Scott's, $3 million Bulova?
So, legend has it that when Scott was on the lunar surface, the crystal popped off of his Omega Speedmaster. And without the crystal on there, of course, the mechanism isn't really protected from the fine lunar dust. And so you need a chronometer of some kind. So he took off the Speedmaster and put on this prototype Bulova that he was given by Bulova before his flight. And to this day, it remains the only privately owned watch on the moon because all the Speedmasters were government property. And some years ago, it was auctioned off for, I think, between $2 and $3 million. It was a huge price tag for a truly unique watch, because it was a prototype in addition to being right. The only one worn on the moon, so the only privately owned one worn on the moon. So that's
I just love the little elements of that on space history. Ed, thanks very much.
My pleasure, absolutely.